All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just curious, did the fire alarm go off here as well, or just upstairs? Okay, so that blinks the total number of fire alarms going off while Henry is in the hotel to 7. And this was the second time I had problems getting a projector up and running. And the last time was like 4 years ago, I think. And I spent 20 minutes talking with a beamer, doing it every 20 seconds, and people quickly taking a picture of what was on there so they could watch it on their screen. So well done, tech people. I think I have like 4 now, getting this sorted. Hey everyone, my name is Henry. I'm a developer and architect from the Netherlands. And it's my pleasure to talk to you about identity and access management today. Now, what I know about conferences is that you shouldn't do lengthy introductions of yourself, so I thought, let's introduce myself, but let's do it in a different way. Because a lot of things that I do, you do as well. But I do something weird, or did something weird. 4 years ago, I bought a house. And I see that there was just one thing that we didn't fix yet when it comes to the screen. I'm so sorry. But now you should see the same thing as I do. I bought a very ugly house in a very beautiful location. And 2 weeks later, I bought this mobile home where I've lived for 3 years. Because my house was being changed a little bit. And this is what happens when you get an engineer in that doesn't know software but knows building. This was, I think they were working for 2 weeks. And I can closely relate to that, because when I go to a new client, about 2 weeks into the gig, they're like, what are you doing? And you might think it cannot get worse than this when it comes to houses, right? Wrong. This was 3 weeks in. And this is 3 years ago. And since then, I've been slowly building up my own house again. This is the last thing that the contractor did. Then I kicked him out. And this is me working at the attic 2 years ago. 1 year and 9 months ago. This is a year ago when I finally got the kitchen in. I didn't build the kitchen myself, by the way. That was the carpenter. And that's me. Something completely different than IT. And you can always find me and talk about building your own house. I love to talk about it for hours and love your stories that you can tell about building your own house. And it's my belief that everybody in IT should do at least one thing that doesn't involve a keyboard or sitting down. And this is my thing. All right, I'm here to talk about something completely else, identity and access management. And I've been going to conferences for a while, and a lot of the talks that I've seen are like 101s into a certain technology. Hey, this is container apps, this is what you can do with it, it's awesome, I just tried it myself for 2 hours, but hey, here I give a conference talk. Well, those talks are important to learn new technologies. It's not the only thing I want. Sometimes I want to learn what somebody built, what somebody did, the mistakes they made, the things they learned. More of a use case study. And that is what this talk tries to be. And I found that it was much harder to prepare this talk. So I hope you bear with me. And if you have any questions, feel free to jump in. The more we can make this a discussion instead of a presentation, the better, I believe. I know the talk is recorded. Try to wait for a microphone if you want to jump in. But from my point of view, the talk is for you here in the room. All right, and this is based on lessons learned across real customers. I will not tell you which customer, but trust me when I say I've tried this at 4 different customers over the last 2.5 years. All right, a talk of 60 minutes requires a little bit of structure, so I'm going to talk first about the challenge that I saw at different companies and which forced me to implement a design, make changes. The requirements that I find important in designing something like this. The solution, what I came up with, and I'm already going to spoil it, there are going to be 3 ingredients. 2 features of Microsoft Entra ID, privileged identity management and access packages, that we will dive into in more detail. But you can probably exchange that with other technology if you're not an Entra ID user. And then, of course, the design, and that's where the bulk of the time is going to be. And then finally, results and experiences. And while this talk is designed for 45 minutes, I did dig up some extra material so that we can really dive into some of the nitty-gritty details if you want to. So we can absolutely fill 60 minutes, but I'd rather have a discussion where I go through 90% of the material and we're all on board, than I rush everything through and you're like, huh? All right, so feel free to jump in. So what's the challenge that I saw when it comes to identity and access management? I think it is very important to recognize that there is a traditional trade-off between two very important things. And the first one is engineers need to do their work. Sounds a little bit obvious, right? But if you walk into a random enterprise and want to get work done on day one, what is going to happen, anyone? You're going to be disappointed, right? There's going to be so much stuff that you need to get sorted before you can get anything done. So that's the thing that I'd like to change. Getting access to things that you need access to should be easy. However, on the other side, there is this organizational concern that you want to make sure that nobody has access to stuff that they don't need access to. Again, sounds very obvious. But in my experience, you get into very heated debates with engineers very quickly. Why do you need global administrator to do my work? Maybe. Can you elaborate on that? Yeah, to do my work. Can you elaborate on that? Oh yeah, every now and then, 2 times a year, I need to create an app registration. Okay, fair enough. Doesn't really warrant global administrator now, does it? So that's a discussion that can, this is a very easy example, but sometimes it can be much more heated. I found that this helps. Of course I trust you. I don't trust the person that steals your account. This is a much better basis for conversation, I find, with engineers. Do trust them, but don't trust the people that misuse their credentials or their identities. And I think if you have an organization that's large enough, you will have examples of this happening almost on a weekly basis, unfortunately. Now, when I look at organizations, I already mentioned the enterprise. I think there are 2 types of organizations that have a very different set of problems that we might be able to solve with the same design. We have the more traditional organization, let's say an enterprise with 10,000 engineers. And we have the much smaller organizations, maybe just 10 engineers. And they have very different sets of problems, but hopefully a unified solution. And I've worked at both. If you look me up, I've worked at a very large bank, and I've worked with an organization that literally had only 6 developers. So let's start with those enterprises. In those traditional organizations, the actual situation for getting access to stuff is incredibly complicated. If you look at, for example, a tool like Effexa that you can use for managing roles and access to stuff, or just simple groups in Entra ID that a lot of organizations use for managing access, it's incredibly complicated and complex. I know for a fact that up to a point in time, it was only possible to be a member of 64,000 and something groups in Entra ID, 2 to the power of something. There have been enterprises in the world asking Microsoft to increase that limit. This is a true story. Now, I find it very hard to believe that on the basis of people being a member of more than 46,000 groups is a design that's easy to understand for everyone involved. So this very complex group structure exists in a lot of companies, and essentially it's used for authorizing you to access stuff. Now, this very complex structure makes it very, very hard to make changes to that structure. Almost all the cases that I've worked with, a change to that structure also had unintended side effects. So what happens over time? We stop changing things. We say to ourselves, we're going to create a new situation, and then we're going to get rid of the old situation. I think we all know what happens. We now have one more situation. So this just grows over time and grows and grows and grows. End overview is completely lacking. But what's very important, I believe, is reviewing access of people to stuff. Now, in structures like this, user-to-group membership is rarely reviewed. This means that over time you accumulate more and more permissions. So if you don't have access to something, you find the person with the longest tenure that you can get access to and see if they maybe can do the stuff that you cannot do. But even a lot of companies are trying to address this, right? Access reviews are becoming more and more common. They're enforced by a lot of security standards. However, on top of that user group membership is a lot of group nesting. And in practice, that's never reviewed. So while you might just be a member of the correct groups, there is a very difficult to understand structure behind it, and you cannot really predict which kind of access you will end up having. So we need to find maybe something else in that situation. Now, we have the other end, and I love working with small organizations because they have a humongous focus on what I like to call getting shit done, which is a thing I believe that all engineers inherently want to do. I don't really believe in any kind of team building except for building cool shit together. If you talk to a software engineer and ask them what was fun about working at a company, they never say they had a pool table. They always say, we built this awesome messaging system that could handle 25 million messages a second. Woo! That's what engineers like. They want to build cool stuff, right? So that's what these organizations really, really do a lot. However, when it comes to identity and access management, the consequence of this is that everything has to be put in line with getting things done. Authorizations are done reactively on a per-user basis. Oh, that's Henry. Of course he needs access to the database. I know who Henry is. I trust him. Dumb. And I give him access. And the problem is that Henry never loses access to the database anymore because that doesn't help getting things done. There is no governance, no design, no review, no auditing, no whatsoever. If you ask questions about this, you're booed out of the building pretty quickly because they don't like that kind of stuff. Now, I believe in simple solutions. I think if I had more time, I would have made this letter longer. It's a beautiful quote. If I had more time, I would have come up with a simpler solution. So I think simple solutions is actually really hard. And what I've tried to do is take a very simple approach to designing authorization boundaries, and I want to talk you through that approach. But before I do that, what do I find important? In heart, I'm an engineer, so I find it very important that people are being able to get their stuff done. They need the permissions for their job. On the other hand, as an organization, I need to be provable in control of who has which permission and why. And especially the why is important, because which permission somebody has, you can in the end always get out of a system. But the why is something that a lot of companies record in other systems, and in the worst case, Excel. This is a pet peeve of mine. Permissions should be given out by the product owner, or the asset owner, or the responsible project manager if you have projects, whatever, but not by the sys administrator. In a lot of companies, for some reason, there is a grumpy old white guy in the cellar, and I'm stereotyping this very deliberately, sorry, who decides if you get access to something or not. And that is ridiculous. Because giving somebody access to an asset is a risky move. There's business risk involved. And business risk should not be taken by a random person in the cellar. It should be taken by the responsible manager or the responsible person in the organization. Now, you can always say that you have to go to that grumpy person with permission of the correct manager. In the end, it really boils down to the person in the cellar deciding which access you get or not. At least I have that experience. So I want to change that. I want to implement a system where a PO can decide you get access or you don't. Nitty-gritty, it has to be compliant with ISO 27001. In the Netherlands, we have another standard which is called NEN something, which is derived and applies to medical companies, which was important as well. But there are more standards that you need to comply with, possibly, but I started with 27001. And I want it to be understandable. So I want to be able to sit down next to an engineer and explain to them why they have access or why they don't. And I want it to be extensible. And my starting point was I want to manage access to Entra ID, Azure DevOps, and Azure environments for teams that build and run their own software on Azure. That was my initial scope. Since then, I have expanded a little bit, but I will dive into that later. So how did I go about it? I already spoiled a little bit. I have 3 ingredients. Access packages, which is a Microsoft Entra ID feature. And I'm curious, who is already familiar with access packages? 1, 2, 3 out of 15-ish. Okay, so that's way above average. I find that this feature is very little known, and I'm a bit in love with it. So I will talk you through that. Privileged identity management. Who's familiar with PIM? Okay, so that's a little bit around half the group. So I think this is changing rapidly, right? If I ask the same people who knew about this a year and a half ago, yeah, okay, so that's the same 3 people again. I think 5 now, okay. So this is rapidly getting more and more traction. And then, of course, we're going to have a design. Now, let's start very quickly with a recap of privileged identity management. It's actually not that difficult. Oh yeah, before I do, I took this slide from my own course on a Cloud Guru/Pluralsight. And now that I've mentioned that, it's with permission. So normally when you get access to something in Entra ID or Azure, you get what we call an active role assignment. You have access. With PIM, instead of you get access, you get permission to get access. You're eligible for a certain assignment. And then you still yourself have to activate that role to elevate yourself to those privileges. The advantage of this is that as long as you don't do that and you click on a dangerous link, there are no consequences maybe, or at least a lower blast radius. And we can also attach extra conditions on activating that role. So that's the 2 advantages of privileged identity management. Access packages are a little bit more complicated. So let's define it as a group of authorizations and everything else around these authorizations to govern their usage. And to make that a bit more concrete, an access package is a structure that has a name and a description. So the name is what you need, and the description is what you need when you don't use the name correctly. And then you can attach 1 or more resources to that access package, stuff that the package should give you access to. And examples are group membership, group ownership, certain roles on applications defined in Entra ID, and, pardon my French, SharePoint. How the hell that came into that list, I really don't know. So there's a new thing added here as well. You can now also get access to Entra ID roles through access packages. But that's not everything. You can also add what are called request rules. For example, somebody has to fill out a ticket number, or you need to get approval from your manager, or from somebody who's a member of a certain group to get that access package. So that's about joining the group. We can define approval rules, under which conditions it can be approved and by who. And we can define what are called lifecycle rules, rules that determine if you should keep maintaining access to that access package. There's one more there. Go take your picture. And as part of that, you can, for example, implement access reviews. Every quarter, a member of a certain group has to review everybody who has access, and if they don't need it anymore, it will get revoked. Now, very important to mention here, before you start calling me out towards the end, is that this isn't included with every license for Entra ID. You're going to need Entra ID P2. Now, in practice, I see that more and more companies are getting P2 licenses because of the advanced protection features. So I don't think that's really that much of a hurdle. But if you want to use this to manage access to Entra ID roles, you're going to require an Entra ID governance license, because that's what Microsoft does, right? Once we've bought the most expensive license, what do? You add another one on top of it. A lot of companies don't have that, but you can still use indirections through groups. That's actually what I will do as well. Do you want to see a demo? Okay, hope so. I'm Dutch. I think there are a number of things that you need to know about the Dutch. We don't walk on wooden shoes. Yes, we do have windmills, but we're very cheap. I bought this picture for my very first presentation, I think in 2017, for €5. And I keep reusing it since then, because then the price per display goes, low. That's how cheap the Dutch are, or at least I am. All right. Privileged identity management. Let's start with that one. But before I do, I want to point out one very interesting nitty-gritty detail. If you look here at the top right, you see that I'm not using my real Entra ID tenant. This is called a Microsoft 365 developer tenant. It is something that's very hidden away. You have to really first search for Microsoft 365 and then developer tenant. But if you're an Azure guy like me, it's going to be very helpful because you get a tenant, 25 pre-populated users, some demo groups, and a lot of stuff in there that you can use for demos or just fiddling around. Now, last time I checked, applying for a new developer tenant was closed because of a lot of misuse. But if you have one, keep renewing it because that keeps working. And as soon as they open up applications again, I highly recommend every nerd in the world to get one to fiddle around with without having to fiddle around in their real tenant. All right, that being plugged, let's go into Microsoft Entra ID and find privileged identity management, which is always somewhere else. Let's go for identity. There we go. So what I can do, I need to start up another browser. Sorry about that. I had everything prepared, but as you saw, I had to reboot my laptop because the screen wasn't working. So let's log in here as one of those 25 users I just mentioned. Do that wonderful thing called MFA. Okay, with that said. Okay. Let's go back here. So I'm now logged in as a global administrator in my tenant. And one of the things that I can do is I can go to Entra ID and go to Roles Administrators, and then find one of the roles that in Entra ID I want to protect with privileged identity management. And I think the most prime example of a role that you want to protect is the global administrator. If I open the details of this role, I can go to Role Settings, and here I can define a number of rules that are going to be applied to activating this role assignment when you're eligible. One of the things that you can see here is I can give up a maximum duration. 8 hours works fine. In the Netherlands, we work 8 hours a day. I can require MFA to be active before activating this role. Up to a couple of months ago, there were still companies not enforcing MFA for logging into the Azure portal. This is now not possible anymore. It's completely mandatory. I tried disabling it for the demo that I'm going to do. I spent an hour and then I gave up. It's not possible anymore to disable MFA, not even with conditional access. But you can also do something else and say, for example, I'm going to require an authentication context to be established. An authentication context is basically just a label. Let's say, for example, important, very important, and ultra important. And I can apply that to both applications or things like privileged identity management. And I can also use those labels in my conditional access flow. And this allows me to decouple the measures that I need to take from classifying how important something is. So I can say here, this is very important as authentication context, and then use that authentication context in my conditional access policy, for example, to require a compliant device connected to the corporate network before you can activate global administrator. So those are some of the things that you can configure when it comes to activating a role. Now going back, yep, that's what I want. I can see what are the assignments for this role. Of course, I love talking to friends about Entra ID. And I can see that I myself, my administrator, is an holder of this role. But I've made an eligible assignment to 2 users here as well, Alex and Johanna. If I now switch to the other browser that I just quickly logged in, where I'm logged in as Alex, I can go to Entra ID, I can go to users, find a example user and, for example, try to reset their password and access is denied. However, if I really feel I need to do that as Alex, I go to privileged identity management, and I go to my roles, and I can see that I'm eligible to become global administrator, activate that role, give a very good description, and activate it. Now I have configured that somebody should give permission before this activation becomes active. So here it says my request is pending for approval. So going back to my standing access as global administrator, I can also find here privileged identity management. Go to tasks, approve requests, and I can see that Alex wants to become an administrator. Approve this, again, give a very good reason for auditing. 21, 22, 23. I go back to Alex, and if I now find a random user, Grady sounds like a great person, let's bug them with a new password. This is a great way for reducing the number of global administrators in your organization greatly. Even if somebody sometimes needs access to that role or to another high privileged role, because this works for other roles as well, you can limit their access and make sure that there is a check in place. That's privileged identity management. Tom, question. Mike. So this is what I run into more than not. So the feedback is you need somebody else available to approve your request. And if that's at 3 a.m., do you really need 2 people awake before you can intervene? That's an organizational question which balances risk by removing that approval and, for example, only relying on a compliant device connected to the corporate network. And then you take a little bit more risk on the security side, but you have quicker resolve time, or you're not going to do that, and you have larger resolve time, but less risk of misuse. That's not a technical decision. That's a business decision. We as technicians should be able to explain the 2 possible design choices, the consequence, and then trust that the manager knows what they're deciding. And I think that's the end of it. It's just a consequence of how this works. Sir. It's a very interesting question. So the question is it possible to define rules like between 9 and 5 you need to take this flow, and between 5 and 9 you need to take another flow? It depends a little bit on what you can do with the authentication context that I mentioned in combination with conditional access. Now, one of the benefits of that authentication context is that I, as an implementer of privileged identity management, do not need to know how the identity guys go about conditional access. So I'm not really up to date in what you can do with conditional access policies. So let's try and find out. Sorry?
It's going towards policy-based authorization, but adding a lot of context there.
Yes, it's indeed going to be more policy-based, the more stuff you build in. And you can do a lot with conditional access. For example, risk-based decisions. I very quickly don't see anything for time. Sorry. Shall we move on to access packages? All right. Another thing that I can do is privileged identity management, home, Entra ID, find identity governance. Where is that today? Identity governance, there. And then I can go to access packages, and here I can define an access package. Like I said, it's a name and a description, and once I've done those, I can start adding resources. Hey, we got a new thing in town, API permissions. Nice. So I can, for example, say that if I get this access package with the legendary name DF, I'm going to become a member of this group, and I'm going to get access to this application. Of course, we're going to skip the devil, and let's see if I have an API defined. Yeah, of course I do. You get permissions on this API as well. I can define who can request access to this access package. Now, I love setting this for all users in the directory, and then in a lot of scenarios you're going to exclude B2B guest members, because this is access to your stuff. Do you need B2B people to use that? Sometimes you do, but by default, I go to don't. I can remove approval, so people can self-approve, but I can add an approval up to 3 stages. Personal opinion, if you need 3 stages of approval, you're doing it wrong. You can start configuring a lot of details here, as you can see. I can even go so far as adding custom questions. For example, if you really want developers to hate you, for which Jira ticket do you need this? And then you can even say, I'm going to require a short text that requires you to do something like this. That's not really what people love to do, putting in ink numbers, but it's possible. Here I can define the lifecycle rules. Now what I like to configure a lot is that access packages never expire. Stuff shouldn't just disappear after time. Instead, I like requiring access reviews. I can configure how often, I can configure who has to do them, the manager or a specific group, etc. That is how you define an access package. Now once I've done that, I switch over to my other user, I can go to a Microsoft portal, and I'm really sorry, but this is Microsoft, so you can guess it's another portal, myaccess.microsoft.com. And here I can go to access packages, and I can see there is a demo access package. I can request access. I think I've done this thing here. Yeah, there you go. And I'm going to say I'm going to require this only for today up to next week. And of course, my reason is blah, blah, blah stuff. And then again, I can switch over to my other user and approve or deny this request. Again, in myaccess.microsoft.com. That's more or less how access packages work. Any questions? Yeah, go for it.
Have you ever seen that justification field being used properly?
So we, at the company I worked, at some point we switched to mandatory reasons for overriding policy, and we often saw the reason dot. Basically, that's not a technical problem. That's a people problem. And I find that fixing people problems with technical means, in the end, leads to a lot of frustrated users and not a really great improvement in the problem. I just feel the best approach is sitting down with that person and talking them through the risks that they're putting on the organization and themselves. If I make a mistake at 3 a.m. after getting access to something, and I said I needed that to fix this ticket, and I have a very good reason, then it's a mistake. If I get access to something important with as reason dot, it's a much harder case to make as an individual that it's actually an accident instead of on purpose. So it's also about self-protecting as an engineer. That's the argument that I try to put forward. And if that doesn't work, in the end, if you work in an organization and you don't want to comply with the rules in the organization, there is always another solution. And in this case, it's in the back of the room. And I have a pretty hard point of view, I think, on that. Follow the rules, change the rules, or get out.
So I agree with that, but in your experience, how often do people really use that correctly?
Oh, okay, fair enough. In the company I worked with latest, it worked perfectly. And I hope when I get to the design, I can show you why this isn't a pain in the backside. Anything else? All right. Then let's go back to my favorite architecture tool. Okay, so the next part is going to be a bit of a design exercise and some thoughts that I want to talk you through. So the first thought is that I believe that everybody in an organization should have a clearly defined role. That's easier said than done in some organizations, but let's look at some examples that we can see in a software development organization, which is a bit of a smaller scope. And I think there are 3 that we can see: product owner, engineer, and stakeholder, or as I like to call them, people that want shit, people that do shit, and people that just talk about shit. Now, if we look at the engineer, I think there is a very important distinction that we need to make in the work that we do. Either we are working in production environment because something is terribly wrong and we need to do stuff manually, or we are doing our day-to-day job. And I think in all honesty, we either need access to the one or the other, never both at the same time. I'm not a big fan of trying to separate this over different people. But as a person, I either take up one role or the other one at every point in time. The second construct is that of a product. I don't have that role towards everything that is being developed in the organization. If you work, I don't know, with 50 developers, I'm not an engineer on everything. Maybe I'm an engineer on products 1, 2, and 3, and on another product I'm a stakeholder, and that's it. So my role is scoped to certain parts of the things that we're building. And this assumes a good architecture. I'm using the term products very deliberately. I believe that every IT organization at some point is going to transform into we're just delivering certain software products or IT products and not projects anymore. We need stuff that is long-lived for access management, because otherwise we're going to get really annoyed by all the reasons that we need to give up. But you can also read assets or systems or whatever fits your organization. But let's take this example, but in reality you should have better names. Now, if we put those two things together, we can create a single access package for every combination of a role and a product to have roles that are scoped to products. And we get a table like this. I'm the product owner for one thing, and I'm the engineer for another, the regular engineer, which I call engineer non-production, or I have exceptional privileges for a while, engineer production. We can also have roles that, for example, span all of the products, like the administrator. So this is how we create our access packages. But then we still need to design how we do add authorizations to stuff. And for that, we're going to use Entra ID groups. And I think that's a familiar concept. And for example, these are 3 of the groups that you might decide to create in this design. All products, Entra ID Global Administrator, Azure DevOps Organization Administrator, and Azure Root Management Group Owner. And I hope you can see there is a pattern here. The product that this relates to, in this case, all products. Then the target system, where do you get authorization on? And then the authorizations that you get into the target system. And that's very deliberate. And then we can use these groups in those target systems to assign the proper permissions there. But if we see these groups in Entra ID, hopefully they give us a more or less understanding of what the authorizations are we're giving out. By the way, if you reach out to me on LinkedIn, I can send you the slides, no problem. Now let's put all of this together. Let's say I'm going to create an access package called All Product Administrator. And if you get that access package, you become a member of these Entra ID groups. Then the next thing we need to do is we need to go in Entra ID or stay in Entra ID and make a role assignment for Global Administrator to that first group. And in my case, I prefer an eligible role assignment. Next up, we have to go into Azure DevOps, and here we use that same group and assign that project collection administrator permissions. And then we go into Azure, and for the root management group, we create an owner role assignment. And all of this putting together, if I now request this access package and it gets approved, I become an administrator of all the things. The final thing that we're going to need is like an approver or reviewer for this assignment. So for that, we're going to create this extra group, all products, Entra ID, access package approver, and everybody in that group can approve requests for their access package, and also everybody who has the access package becomes a member of this group, and this is our bootstrap construct. It's important to recognize that while I draw this in one diagram, this is split out over multiple systems. The actual assignments of authorizations live in those target systems. Waiting for the picture. And from here on, we can start, building out this design more and more towards other things. For example, for a product, the product owner access package should make you a member of a group Azure DevOps product owner and Azure cost reader. For some reason, product owners always want to know what stuff costs. For the first one, there's a bit of a decision if you use Azure DevOps in a way where you have a project in Azure DevOps for each product or project that you're working on, you're probably going to assign a role on that project. I don't know, collaborator or reader or something. I'm a firm believer of another strategy, which is called one team project, meaning that all the resources of the whole organization are going to be in one product or project, and you just give access to stuff based on access control lists. This is a little bit more work to set up, but if somebody has access to more things, or you start doing inner sourcing, it's much less of a hassle to switch between different boards, different repositories, etc. So in my case, I have to assign a number of access control lists on certain resources in Azure DevOps. And in Azure, I'm just going to create a role assignment for the built-in role cost reader. I'm going to add one more group, access package approver for this product, which allows the PO to create new POs. And again, here is a bootstrap loop. I can do stakeholder, single group, Azure DevOps stakeholder, the correct access control lists, reading on repositories, a read-write maybe on issues, or work items. Maybe they can see the pipelines that have run so they know what has gone to production when, but they cannot change anything. Engineer non-production, read-write on repositories, use on service connections, read-write on work items, etc. in Azure DevOps through a group called Azure DevOps Engineer. And there is another group, Azure non-production read-write, meaning that for all the subscriptions in Azure that are associated to that product, they get the contributor role on that subscription. There are a number of assumptions here, and the first one is subscription vending or subscription democratization, namely that every workload, every deployment of an application gets their own subscription, a model that I highly recommend. Don't start throwing out resource groups to teams, but give them complete subscriptions. And the contributor role is also very deliberate. If you make them owner, they can start giving other people access, and that's not a thing that you want, because then they can break out of the design. But in non-production environments, I do want my engineers to be able to make changes, hence contributor and not reader. That's a choice. If you ever need to hand out permissions as an engineer, for example, to service principals, you're hopefully going to use your pipeline to do that. So your pipeline has more privileges than the engineers. Another thing that I also do is I give read access to the production environments to non-production engineers. I believe it is part of the day-to-day job of an engineer to be able to see what thing costs, to access monitoring data, to access metrics, etc., etc. So to do that, I give them the reader role in Azure. And here it's important to know that I think for years now already, Microsoft has completely separated out access to any kind of data of that reader role. So this does not mean that engineers have read access to production data concerning your customers, only the production resources in Azure. And I think in a lot of cases, that's a valid choice. And then again, we're going to have the access package approver for that product as the approver and the reviewer for this access package, meaning now that the PO can go into myaccess.microsoft.com and review access requests for the stuff that is part of the product or products they are responsible for. And then finally, the engineer production. It has just a single group, Azure production owner, and meaning that on all the production subscriptions associated with the product, they get owner permissions. And the access package approver group is there as well. Again, it is important to realize that here the owner role is a very deliberate choice as well. Here I do want them to be able to give out permissions. Because if you are in your production environment and you find that the system is not running because the service principal does not have access to the database, you want to be able to fix that as an engineer. So here I gave them ultimate power, the reason being time to fix, and the trade-off is a little bit more risk. And that's a conscious decision in most cases where I've worked. It is important to understand that the engineer ideally never holds this role, right? This is only when stuff hits the fan. And I think there is no better way to frustrate an engineer that wants to fix stuff that's in the fan by not giving them enough permissions. So this is why this choice is made. All right, before I move on, are there any questions? Criticism? Thoughts? Time to process needed. Yes, sir. So I'm just getting, sorry, I couldn't hear the first part of your question, but I think the question is, would I also apply privileged identity management to that owner role assignment? That's a good question. So this is based on the real world. But when I designed this, it was much harder or not even available to have that PIM in Azure that we had in Entra ID. So that's the reason it's not there. It's a great improvement on this design to have privileged identity management here as well. Good point. Thank you. Don't send me a bill. Sorry, it's very hard to hear you talk when the podium cracks that much. So my results and experiences. Let's start with some positive things. The product owner is in charge of being able to decide who gets access and who not. My personal pet peeve is met, and that's the most important thing when you're an architect, right? Another thing, it's a workable solution for engineers. We've had a number of people come into my last client, and at the first day, in the morning, they sat down to somebody, and they were told to go to myaccess.microsoft.com, request a number of access packages, and 5 minutes later, they were ready to go. Everything that we did in our engineering organization was attached to those access packages, and that worked out great. I am provable in control of who has which authorizations, because this design is simple enough to understand and explain to an auditor, and then in Entra ID, all the decisions are recorded with the famous reasons, which are hopefully filled in correctly. So I have a very good audit record. Privilege escalation is always logged. In our case, a lot of times people are able to elevate themselves, but it's still logged, and they have to provide a reason. In the end, this is mostly for hindsight, slapping people when they're doing the wrong thing. Or, if they don't do it deliberately, educating people. Maybe much more important. Access reviews are enforced. When I came in, there was this humongous set of Excel sheets that people had to go through with all the assignments and then tick them off as reviewed. Apparently, it only took them 10 seconds because you do yes in the first column and then you drag that all the first row and then you drag it all the way down. We are now enforcing this through tooling. And we have successfully extended this to other systems than just Entra ID, Azure DevOps, and Azure. It's not all perfect. One of the problems that we see is that review results are not immediate. When you have an access review running, you give up a window in which the decider has to decide, and only at the end of the window, the decisions get applied. So we had one instance where somebody's access needed to be revoked for reasons, and we only realized a little bit too late that it wasn't affected yet because the PO thought, oh, I have an open access review, I just switch him to do not extend. And we didn't realize that at that point in time. When you have multiple reviewers, which I recommend, for each product we have DPO and we have a deputy PO, which steps in when they're on holiday or away for more than a few hours. But it also means that they cannot see the actions that the other person has taken. So they both get an email, you need to review this. And normally that goes well because you know if the person that you're working very closely with is there or isn't. But sometimes they're away for a couple of hours for a meeting and the deputy steps in because it's important enough to keep the work going. And then the original PO returns from their meeting. Apparently that's what POs do. And then they don't see the review request anymore and nothing else. So that was highly confusing at the start. There's no support for managing app registration access as a resource. This is a pain in the backside, because I can now manage access to almost all the resources in Entra ID and Azure that an engineer really needs access to, except for app registrations. So we have some indirections through groups for being able to create a new app registration. That works, but then to assign the whole team as an owner of that app registration is not possible, and we have to do that manually. Also because you cannot assign a group as an owner, yet. I hope. You cannot revoke authorizations effective immediately. So if you have to let somebody go because something really went wrong, you still have to keep them in the office, locked in a meeting room for an hour, while you make sure that all their authorizations are revoked. So that's what I had prepared to share with you. I have, like I said, a number of more detailed designs for people that want to really get into the nitty-gritties of the access control list or the authorizations that I assign. Feel free to walk up to me during the day or right now. I will be here for the remainder of the day and tomorrow morning. I love talking to you about this that I've done. I can get you the slides, can talk about other stuff, Azure or building houses. Otherwise, thank you for your attention, and I hope you have a great remainder of the conference. stuff you want to see.